Good afternoon and welcome. We'll get going soon, but first we're going to give everyone another moment to join. Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, Polling and Marketing Research. Did the pollsters blow it again in the 2020 presidential election? It's presented by the American Marketing Association, Southern Connecticut chapter. While we're waiting, I'm just going to take a few moments to talk about your regional American Marketing Association chapter in Southwestern Connecticut and the AMA. Our chapter officially serves Fairfield County and the environs, up to New Haven and north toward Litchfield, and also unofficially Westchester County. Membership is open to professionals, academics, and students, really anyone with an abiding interest in marketing. The local chapter presents 8 to 10 events per year that are open to the public, and in this board year is planning a few members-only events as well. When we do charge for events, our members pay less than the general public. For the foreseeable future, we're going to be holding our events online like we are here today, and some will be free, and others will have a small fee to help pay for chapter operations. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that will provide financial assistance to a local charity here in Fairfield County, Connecticut, resources to help minority-owned businesses gain greater exposure, and create internship opportunities for minority students from area colleges and universities. Right now, AMA National is having a sale on memberships and has waived chapter fees. With a new focus on member perks, training, and certifications, there's never been a more important and beneficial time to join. Our local chapter is offering events such as this afternoon's panel discussion, and our website at amasouthernt.org has our upcoming and past event information, as well as a soon-to-be-launched job board. If you'd like to become involved as a member, volunteer, or serve on the board, please see the site for contact information, or you can email our membership chair, Richard Connor, at richard.s.connor, C-O-N-N-E-R, @gmail.com. Before we get going, last thing, I want to thank our sponsors of the chapter. That's Alpha Graphics of Stamford, a full-service printer, Altamira, a branding and design agency in Westport, Connecticut, Austin Lawrence Group, a B2B SaaS marketing firm with advisory services, Media Associates, an amazing media buying operation, and our past president, Ben Coons, head dog in business development there, and Wonderland, a great recruiting firm with a focus on marketing professionals like ourselves. So now on with our show. So we have two awesome panelists today, help shed light on how the pollsters blew it. So I guess I've answered the question. And what the future holds for marketing research. We're delighted to have with us Janice Caston, VP of Global Marketing and Operations for ITWP, the parent of Taluna, based in Wilton, Connecticut, and Julian Beresford, President of Beresford Research. These two are experts at marketing research, and we're sure to have a great conversation. Panelists, before we get started, could you please tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do? Janice, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Janice. I work at Taluna, as mentioned by Ken. Taluna is a consumer insights firm that offers technology and access to respondents, or people who take surveys in real time. So as a brand, as someone interested in gaining consumer insights, you can do this very much yourself, or you can speak to one of our experts. I've been with the company for about 10 years now. My background is in market research and marketing. So I'm essentially marketing the market research products that we have to sell. So I'm a researcher, but also a marketer, and can wear two hats today to talk to you all as marketers as well. Thanks, Ken.
And my name is Julian Beresford. It's nice to meet you all, or to speak with you. I started Beresford Research back in 1994, first as 1991 as a strategy and marketing firm, but then switched to research when I recognized it was just a fascinating way of doing both strategy and research. And we specialize in thought leadership studies, typically, a lot of work with C-level audiences, and our clients tend to be professional service organizations, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Julian. And for those of you who don't know, my name's Ken Lempit. I'm president of the AMA Southern Connecticut chapter and president and chief business builder at my agency, Austin Lawrence. So let's get right into it. We want to talk a little bit about how we got here. Not so much the political side, but everybody had 4 years to get it right after the 2016 election surprise. How is it possible that pollsters were still really so wrong in 2020? Julian, do you want to start us off with some of your perspective on how we got here today?
Sure. Well, while there's no question there were some big mistakes and wrong calls, for the most part, actually the research or the polls got it right if you consider what a lot of people don't pay attention to, which is the margin of error, which is typically for these polls, both statewide and national, about plus or minus 4 percentage points. So a lot of them were really close, and that's what they predicted. Overall, they predicted a Biden win, and it was narrowly a Biden win on the Electoral College. But in each of the states, there were some surprises. Janice, what's your thought?
Yeah, so I think when I was kind of looking into things further, and as we all were as researchers, during the election, obviously, the overall predicted popular vote was 7.2% in favor of Biden. And I think that what we wound up seeing was, and obviously votes had been counted as this was being published, but it was around 3.8%. So Julian, to your point, when we're thinking about the overall percentage, the margin of error, that actually kind of leads us to say that, yes, there were challenges, there were certainly issues, but overall, directionally and with with confidence, we've selected Biden, of course, ahead of the election. There are several things that folks in our profession would speak about, and overall, the importance of quote unquote sampling or finding an audience that you're studying that's representative of the actual, the audience that you're liking, want to project to is the most important part. And so I can talk a little bit about that process and where I think sampling might not have been as accurate as it could have been. And the first is obviously, and you'll hear this all the time when you hear about the election, it's voter turnout, right? So if you're asking someone who they might vote for and that person doesn't get to the polls, obviously that voter is that's a person that's given you a response that isn't someone who's actually voted. And we hear about this often, but obviously with the pandemic, that's changed everything. We saw not only voters that wouldn't have typically voted participate, but we also saw voter turnout changes, in favor of the other outcomes. So that's one. And I don't know, Julian, if you have any comment about voter turnout, because we hear about it all the time.
No, I think you're exactly right. But there were more people. Trump got more votes than any other Republican candidate in history. But so did Biden. So yes, it was record turnout, and certainly the pandemic affected people's ability to go to the polls. So many voters, particularly Democrats, went to use the mail-in ballots, early voting, and that's why there was that Trump mirage on Election Day, because most Republicans voted on Election Day, and you had to wait for those other states or for those other ballots to be opened, many of which weren't allowed to be counted by there were legislatures that said you can't open them before Election Day. So Florida was an exception. Florida did allow them to open up, and there was less of a red effect in the beginning, but Trump did indeed win Florida.
Mm-hmm. I think the other sampling challenge that we've heard about quite a bit is the underrepresentation, or the fact that in some cases Republican voters are less likely participants. I think within some of the industry publications that we've kind of both probably looked at, polling actually favors folks that answer the phone, that participate in surveys, that get involved, and we actually see certain groups do that more than others. Interestingly, college students were very likely to participate in polling. Polls in general have a more liberal rate of participation. There are oftentimes folks that are, unlikely to participate in surveys, and we found that that group tended to reflect the Trump voter. So Trump voters were less likely to participate in survey research or polling ahead of the election as well, was a general statement too.
Yeah, the other thing I would add is there's the concept of the shy Trump voter, people who didn't even want to admit to a pollster that they were supporting Trump. And some pollsters got around that by asking people who their network or who their social group tended to support, as a way of getting around the shyness or the reluctance of people to say that they supported President Trump. So there were some really unusual issues in this election. And by the way, the pollsters were much closer in the 2018 election. They predicted the blue wave, and it was.
So
Right.
You guys have touched on the subject of like getting to people. I mean, is the fact that so many people are cutting the cord or only working with cell phones impacting the reachability of a representative sample?
That's a good question. I think it points to the need for you to really consider the sample that you're going after. And there are certainly ways that you can get to just about anyone. It's a question of, a couple of things. You need to make sure that you're structuring your sample appropriately. In this case, obviously, when you're asked about who you're going to vote for, the first question should be, do you plan to vote? Because if you don't plan to vote, it's irrelevant to pollsters and, in general, who you're voting for. And that's always the case. And that's certainly something that, applies to anything that you're asking about. Do you plan to buy this product? Do you plan to, view this program? That's always kind of where you might want to start. In terms of getting to the right people, there's always something called weighting. And I'm sure Julian can talk about this better than I can. But if you find the essence of the right group that you have, you can actually weight data so that you don't need to survey every last person that meets that criteria. You can actually develop a sample that's representative of those people that have cut the cord by weighting data to get to that projection. Julian?
No, that's exactly right. Right. But in order to weight, you need to know what you're weighting, what the baseline is. And the problem with cell phones is that people, because you can take your number wherever you want, portability of numbers, you don't know necessarily when you have a cell phone that you reach someone that they're actually a voter in that state. Now you can ask them, but it's not something that you can weight against, because you don't know how many cell phones are in a particular area because of people who move about. And that was a problem that I heard an interview about from the person who runs the Iowa poll, who apparently was an outlier, but she called it right because she only was using land-based phones, because that way she could weight appropriately.
Interesting. We did have a question right while we're on this topic, and I want to remind the people attending that we have a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and at any time, please feel free to ask questions of our panelists. And we do have a question. Gary asks, what have we learned from this election that can help with future polls? I mean, that's a good one.
Yeah. So I think we continue to improve, right? I think, as Julian mentioned, was this election wrong? No. On election night, I think we would have had a different answer, right? That trickle effect really did kind of give pollsters the black eye on the night of, because Trump was, in a different position than he certainly is today. So I think we're kind of coming out of that. It's almost like a bad PR outcome, right? We see a negative night of, and now it's kind of rectifying itself, and it's moving in a different direction. but yet there's no one who's going back in time and saying, well, wait a second, now pollsters actually didn't get it all that wrong. So there were certain states that were predicted well, obviously. There were certain states that did not kind of fall in line. So I think that we've really understood the importance of the state by state measure and looking at each state individually, and the importance of sampling, right? So getting to that right sample is important. And I think this year with the mail-in ballot, which is something that I don't think will ever go away, we're getting more voter turnout than ever before. This is a huge, I don't think anybody's focused on this, and it really should be an area of focus. The number of people that are voting, the fact that we're able to really get, folks to vote that haven't probably voted many in years or ever, is huge. And so I think now that we all understand that that's the case and that's going to happen, that's a huge area of opportunity for us to improve. We now know that voter turnout will dramatically change, and did in the last election as well.
And as a backdrop, voter turnout historically has been very low. For this country that prides itself on its democratic principles, it was rare to get more than 50% of people who were qualified to vote to actually vote. Now, it was higher for presidential elections, obviously, but I think it's an encouraging trend, frankly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it does stress the importance, it's all about sampling. And I think as folks that might use market research or surveys in our own businesses and to think about not necessarily election, but it goes back to the idea of needing to survey or to get responses from people that actually match the population of interest that you're looking to study. Right.
And that's where screening questions become important. You have to screen appropriately to only get those people in the net or in the sample that you want.
So one of the things that occurred to me as you guys were talking was that, all politics is local, right? So my question really is all polling local? And do you need people with local expertise to truly understand a market in order to be certain that you're reaching into the demographic accurately?
I don't think you need people who are necessarily living in the demographic. However, you obviously have to be attuned to the differences around the country, which are huge. So
I just think there are behavioral differences, right, in different parts of the country. In the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, almost nobody has a home phone, as an example.
Right.
So the way these populations are made up are very different. I mean, if you go to, Ohio, I bet there's a lot more home phones in Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great local expertise is always important. And whether you're conducting research about an upcoming election or you're looking to do a study that's global in nature, and you need to understand that people in a certain market have a completely different behavior or way of engaging. So that local expertise is certainly important as you're structuring the sample. Does it need to be in market? It's probably helpful because you do understand that local nuance, right? But I think that there are really smart people that can look at populations and project to populations. I'd favor sampling accuracy in that discipline over local expertise.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So you'd want someone who really understands how to build a representative sample and does so, using those building blocks regionally more so than someone who sits in market and doesn't have that view of sampling.
Fair enough. One more question on this topic came from Richard, who says, are you worried, Janice, you referred to a black eye, and that might create a negative perception in terms of marketers trusting their research partners and those findings? Has there been any spillover?
That's a great question. I think that's a really good question. We're always, the research industry is always, meant to provide a level of confidence in the decision making or help you to decide, how you're moving things forward. And so that's, the assistance that we provide within the industry, within the consumer insight space. I can tell you we're probably one of 5 different webinars that are happening today about this topic. APOR, which is one of the research industry bodies that we look closely to. Everyone's studying this. and actually, providing guidance as to, how best to sample. And that's an area of focus that we're all very, very attuned to. Most research isn't about predicting an election. It's studying products that are going to market. More than likely, the responses, the turnout, the sampling questions or issues that we see with polling don't exist for market research studies. And I think most consumer insights people understand that. When you're looking to, conduct research about a new commercial or piece of creative, there aren't people that would give you an incorrect response because they're worried about what you're going to think. So there are many of the things that are systemic that relate to an election that don't exist with general research. And so, from a consumer insights perspective, I think we're doing a very good job to that effect. I don't know, Julian, if you've got any thoughts about that.
I think in general, you're right. Although, of course, there are some personal hygiene products that where it is very important to talk to people who would potentially use the product. And that's where you need to use some of that. But in general, you're absolutely right. When you're talking about trends, in business with executives, it's less important. It's important to make sure you're talking to executives so that you're representing executives and not imposters. But
so we actually have two questions that I'm going to put into one coming from our audience. And I guess the question really is, what is there an impact of the communication of polling upon the electorate, especially where there might be a close election? Are people more or less likely to vote? And then sort of tying back to accuracy, are we going to get really good data out of Georgia?
I think that we saw fewer Democrats voting than predicted in some of the under the hood things that I had seen. So in some cases, when we were predicting on the state level a landslide, that could have been the case, right? There's an overwhelming Biden majority, and folks aren't as compelled to vote because they feel as though it's going to happen. And do I need to get outside and at 7 p.m. after a long day of work, maybe working from home, go and vote? I definitely think that you do see that tend to happen. Obviously, in this case, there was so many mail-in votes, that's certainly a bit of difference. But I do think that when you see a landslide or projected victory in your favor, you're not going to vote. So I do think that had some impact, particularly on the states that were underrepresented.
Hey, that's great. I think I want to land it there because we have a lot of other topics that we wanted to get to. And if I have a couple more questions to come in on this, we'll do it in the Q&A at the end. And I want to thank everyone for jumping in. But I think we can talk now maybe a little bit about better ways of asking questions. I think, some of the limitations of the outcome in polling and marketing research might have to do with, how we're approaching people to get their opinions or the preferences, and maybe registering subtleties in that, or the ability to dig in when something interesting happens in real time. And in particular, we were talking about 3 technologies and their impact on the process. And those were chatbots, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality. And they're very different, yet I think they each have a significant impact on how we ask and what we learn. Do we want to start maybe with chat and what the opportunities there are, and how that does in some ways a better job of asking questions? Julian, you want to take us out?
Sure. Chatbots are fabulous for testing surveys, and they're also fabulous for rudimentary questions, sort of initial questions. We've probably all dealt with chat boxes in chats, that sort of thing. But they can be used in market research to gather some preliminary information. And depending on their sophistication, they can go take people through the whole survey. Janice, as I recall, you folks use one on your website. That's quite good.
Yeah, the sophistication that you wind up seeing these days with chatbots provide a more natural experience. You'll notice that they're used, or actually in some cases, they're so good you might not notice that they're chatbots. But anytime that you're looking to develop engagement, as opposed to sending someone a link with a flat file and they're asked to fill in questions, it's a much more natural behavior when you're actually engaging with someone. I'll say that it's not really someone, it might be, technology. It's much more natural. You'd be more likely to give a deeper response. To your point, Julian, if someone says, well, what do you think about that in a chat environment? You might give them a better response than you would a flat survey that has a write-in box or something that's less rich. So it's a much more engaging experience. And I think that's really, survey research over time has always gone where the people are. We've always found a way to kind of say, okay, well, is it most convenient to get to people, in person, and then the phone, and then ultimately online? We've always kind of tried to evolve to meet respondents where they are. And so this is one of those ways to do that, to provide a better experience. Is it something that would be used on every survey that you're doing? No, probably not. But certainly in the areas of, consumer feedback, if you're talking to a brand that you've engaged with, more than likely those types of surveys will be chat experiences, because they want to keep that engagement high and make you feel good about participating.
Yeah, I would agree.
I'm wondering if also chat can be a useful way to recruit. Like if you have somebody visiting a website and they meet a certain criteria that you can pick up from their cookie trail, can you then offer up the opportunity to participate?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. We know more about people these days before they get to your website, essentially, than even sometimes after, asking them questions. So yeah, chat is actually really engaging. I think a lot of, from a marketing perspective and certainly from a research perspective, we actually use chat on our landing pages. And we find that, 30% of the time, people are much more willing to chat with a chat bot, than they would to form fill and to provide information that way. So I think it really depends on the experience. You want to use it diligently. It does take longer when you're chatting with someone. You've got to wait for the back and forth, like asynchronous, kind of experience. So I think we would all stop doing it if we were always presented with chatbots. But when used in the right context, they're very effective.
Maybe we should kind of marry that up to the idea of artificial intelligence here. How is AI impacting the art of asking questions or knowing the right person to ask a question of?
Well, AI is actually behind many of the chatbots. Artificial intelligence, as I'm sure our audience knows, is making huge gains in all kinds of industries. And market research is just one of the examples where it is making tremendous inroads. Just this morning, I had a demonstration from a firm in Singapore that's launching a product that can take tabulated output and create PowerPoint slides. And it can figure out with artificial intelligence whether it should be a bar chart, it should be a pie chart, it should be landscape or vertical, whatever. It was really quite surprising. Not totally ready, but it's very, very impressive. That's another example of artificial intelligence in market research.
Maybe going back to the prior whole section, can AI or machine learning help us build better samples, or is that still in the hands of people like, people, analysts versus machines?
That's a good question. So AI can help, in terms of, predictive outcomes. You can kind of use information, and let's say you don't even know much about an individual person. You can impute some of the data about that person based on where they live, based on, where you live might dictate your likelihood of having a dog. And so while the national population, 25% of people might have a dog, but in your region, that number's higher. So I can say, more than likely you have a dog, with a level of confidence that might be higher. The idea that I can impute data about someone is interesting. The unfortunate thing about, AI and helping people to understand what someone might do. It really doesn't understand the why behind why they might do that thing. And so while I might own a dog, why I own that dog, why I, might vote for a certain candidate, these are all things that you need to question, no matter how much, information you might project about someone. So I think there's, even with AI, there's still certainly a role for survey research, because as marketers, we need to understand the why behind the what, or why behind what actions being driven.
So I just want to underline that point. We're going to get to it later when we talk about DIY, but there's a level of expertise that goes into making good survey instruments, good sample, good analysis, good recommendation, right? I mean, there's...
But Ken, it's interesting because the part you left out is the sort of back office grinding of data, collection of data and doing the tabulation and all that. That is somewhat rote, and that can be automated and is being increasingly automated.
I did that on purpose, Julian. I left that there for you. Hey, let's talk briefly about VR. What's the use case for virtual reality in market research? What can we do there that we can't easily do otherwise?
Well, imagine a store shelf in the past. In order to approximate what it would be like for a shopper to experience a reconfigured store shelf, you actually had to reconfigure that store shelf, and it took an enormous amount of time. With virtual reality, it can be done in minutes. People can wear a screen and they can tell you how they feel about the placement of different products and different colors, different offers, and everything else. So from that's one example of where virtual reality can be a game changer in market research. But Janice, you may have some other examples.
Yeah, I think, especially as people are less likely to leave their home, in some cases, I've seen VR used when you're reproducing a high-end or very nuanced experience. If you're going out to, let's say, buy a one-of-a-kind car or test drive a new configuration of car, that might be another case where you're looking at VR as a great way of actually experiencing what it's like to look at the interior of a car in a realistic way without actually having to build that car or that configuration. That's a really high-end example of something that could be done. I've seen VR used in marketing for high-end or luxury home tours. That's a little bit outside of the market research realm, but it's the same type of an idea. When you need to replicate an experience, and in some cases, when that experience hasn't even been built yet, it's really effective. In the market research space, we're often, testing things that aren't going yet to market. And so anytime we can give people a taste of what something might actually be or look like or wind up becoming, it produces a better result. If we say, oh, well, there's going to be a chip that tastes sort of like popcorn, but it's also, going to look sort of like a potato chip, that's really hard to envision. But then if you were to present pop chips, that's obviously a much more realistic, visualization of what something might be. I don't think that we'll see it in the area of individual products until the technology is well owned and it becomes more distributed. Let's say 30 to 40% of people have a VR system in their home. Obviously, at the moment, I think we talked about this, Julian, right now, you would have to, in order to get someone to experience VR, you'd have to equip them with that VR product. And so that can be quite costly, coupled with the design of whatever you're looking for them to experience. So it's cost prohibitive now, but I do see that changing. I don't know what you think, Julian.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the New York Times, of course, championed a do-it-yourself virtual reality device made of cardboard, and it required an iPhone to be dropped into it. And they're still producing content that puts you into these places around the world. It's quite amazing how real it feels.
Well, I think that's a great place to land this topic, but I would encourage attendees, if you have questions about these technologies and market research, put them in the Q&A pane and we'll get to as many as we can after the discussion part is complete. I want to turn to a really favorite topic, which is DIY tools. Those of us who were in the design game when desktop publishing became a thing, came to realize that everybody thought they were an art director because they had PageMaker on their PC or Mac. And DIY research tools have really changed the game in market research. Everybody thinks they're a researcher. So these are important decisions and questions that are being asked. So Janice, maybe you want to lead us out on
Sure.
the applicability of DIY tools. And in fact, you guys purvey DIY.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to talk about the applicability, the use case, and considerations for when you need more than your own wits to make good decisions.
I'm somebody who always likes to get more than my own wits on most everything. But, so when we first started as a company, we were very consultative and we provided consultative research services. We were actually more focused on getting people to take surveys and developing the technology to take surveys, but we were ourselves the users of that technology. And so what was given to clients was really our expertise, but more access to, a light touch. They would have a reporting link. They would have some element of the project in their own hands. But we've since evolved and we've gone kind of where the market is headed. Obviously, after we've all used SurveyMonkey to execute a survey probably in our professional careers at some stage, we found that more and more people wanted to have full direct access to survey platforms. Now, I say this with Ken's example in mind. No one really wants to have full access to a survey platform without expertise baked in, or a touch when required, and consultative services. A SurveyMonkey survey is just that. You're kind of relying on your own wits to write a good survey. I use the expression often where if your first question is, how much do you like this? You've already blown your survey results because you're leading a respondent to basically say that they might like something that they don't like. So it's not easy to write a good survey, and that's really basic. But when you're making decisions about products to bring to market, when you're making decisions about the concepts that people like best, you really want to trust the professionals. In many cases, that expertise is baked into the survey itself, and you can use a DIY tool that has a great survey instrument included. But we go back to sampling, and you'd want to make sure that that project is getting to the right respondent, and that you're, sampling the project well, and you're getting data that's actually actionable because it's well written. So survey platforms have evolved. They're great. Obviously, we provide one. Our expertise is very much baked in. But there are definitely cases where you want to talk to someone and get service along with that, or expertise. And I'd say that is a good majority of the time. And Julian, you can certainly talk about that.
Well, I was just going to say that I agree with everything that Janice is saying. And many of our clients result from do-it-yourself projects gone awry, either because they recognized they didn't know how to ask the questions properly, or they didn't know how to get the right audience for their survey, or they thought they were a lot of our clients are consultants and they're really smart. So they think they can do everything. And I'm sure they can do a pretty good job, but when it comes to the mechanics of a survey and then interpreting it and everything else, there is expertise. And we're happy to help bail those companies out when needed, and often start from scratch. Say, what are your objectives? Forget about the questions. What are your objectives? Okay, now that we understand and we all agree these are the objectives, let's write questions that make sure we address each of those objectives. And that often gets things started in the right way.
I was going to say, I think there's also got to be some sensitivity to the implications of decision making. So if we're going to invest $10 million on changing packaging for one reason or another, whatever the driver is, it might be worth investing some money to make sure we're not going to impact consumer choice, right, at retail. Or if we change the look and feel of the front of the Cadillac, we're not going to lose, a bunch of people who are beginning to come to the brand. So these decisions probably are, the more that's at stake, the higher the value of the advice, right?
Absolutely. And research is always kind of, painting a picture, and you've got knock-on effects that you've just mentioned. There are knock-on effects. If you're launching a new product and your product is part of a line of products, are you going to launch this product and draw from other products in your line? If you're putting something in market and there's a claim associated with that, does that claim resonate best? Is that the right claim to choose? You might say, well, it's got low sodium and people are interested in this, and we've tested and people are interested in low sodium. There are ways of testing that in addition to other kinds of claims that you might be making to get to the right one. So I think, what's awesome is that, we now have the ability to make those choices. I think in the past, in some cases, research was less accessible. And so folks like us on this call wouldn't necessarily be talking about research because it was very siloed within a very significant budget, and sitting with, someone that basically was managing to that budget and said no to a lot of things. So I think what you're seeing now is almost like a democratization of research, but it's the right kind of research that should be done, in a DIY, a smart, DIY capacity, is oftentimes additive. It's research that might not have been done in the past. It's the lower end research. It's early stage research. It's things that you might not have had the budget or the time to do, and now can be done in a really impactful and expert way.
And quickly with online resources.
So you brought up a point that, maybe flew past, which is like with support. Can you just elaborate a little bit? Like if I'm, I have more money than a free SurveyMonkey account, right? So I can invest some, but maybe I'm not going to do a $300,000 big study. What's the middle ground or the entry point to advice?
Yeah, so you would want to use, like a survey methodology that's been developed with rigor. You mentioned that you wouldn't necessarily want to go in and do a SurveyMonkey survey that has no infrastructure behind. You'd want to use a survey methodology that might be DIY. You're not, you're not really going to do it yourself. You're in that kind of assisted DIY kind of situation. You're using a great DIY platform that has expertise baked in, but you might not know how to sample your project. You might not know how to, conduct a certain series of questions. You might not know how to customize that methodology. There is an assisted DIY, kind of space, because as you can imagine, the publishing example is a great one. There are things that you can do and you will do, but there are certainly things that are outside of your scope and remit. And so we find that we assist clients with sampling often. We'll customize survey, we'll help with interpretation of result. When you're speaking to Julian, you're looking for real help.
Yeah, and I was going to actually turn the conversation there and say, so Julian, how do you know when you're out of your league? I mean, in my mind, I think of, if you don't know how to pack a parachute, maybe you get an expert before you jump out of the plane. That's a pretty obvious one. But, how does someone who's trying to scope out, product, research, trying to do some research, how do they know when they're out of, when they really need a full service approach?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the answer is oftentimes they don't know. And that's when they get into trouble. But perhaps how they should know is, how important is it that you can deal with bad information coming back to you? Or what's the value of, what are we going to do with the results? Even before we field the first survey, when we get our 300 or our 500,000 responses and it's all tabulated, what are we going to do with it? And if it's just to sit on the shelf and to make sure that you made the right, if it's not so important, it doesn't have such an impact, maybe you don't need to go to a professional. But if this is something that's going to change the direction of the company, or it's a new product line, or it's a go, no-go decision, then you want to have experts help you get to the right decision point.
Fair enough. got a couple more topics I want to get done before we go to Q&A. And just remind people attending, Q&A box is open at the bottom of your screen. Please do give us your questions. And we'll probably push them now to the end of the session to get answered. I want to move past one topic to get to, I think, an interesting one for folks, to talk about data visualization. Because I feel like, there are plenty of us who look at tables and tables of data and we just sort of gloss over, and we're either not able or not inclined to dig into tabular data. What are the real opportunities in visualization? I think I want to look both within the firm commissioning the research, and then what are the other uses of visualization that we can maybe surface to the general public?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I want you to go, Julian, because you opened my eyes to this, so thank you.
There are several companies out there with excellent tools. One of the better known one is Tableau, but they're by no means the only player. And what data visualization allows the user to do is to see a set of crosstabs brought to life. So instead of looking at columns of data and that sort of thing, you can imagine a PowerPoint chart that you can manipulate based on your preferences. So instead of just seeing the total result, which is the typical chart, you can see it by region, or maybe it's shown to you by region, but you'd be interested to see it by company size or job title or profitability. Whatever parameter is of interest to you, you have the ability to allow the user to change the data and change the chart. It's not changing the data, it's changing the chart and the presentation of that data. So that's useful not only to the client, the internal client, but that can be useful to the external client, the audience, the ultimate audience. And you can even combine it with little short questions that they can do benchmarking, and they can see how they compare to the collected survey results. It's really powerful. So anyway, it's something that we championed about 3 or 4 years ago. It took us a while to figure out how to harness the power of it, but it turns out to be a wonderful attribute that we can offer to clients as an extra to make it either to help the clients share the results within the company or externally.
I think, yeah, go ahead, Ken.
No,
Sorry.
I was just going to try and get the talking stick to you, Janice. So
yeah, I think that it's I think that if I were to talk about visualization, it's like we talked about democratizing survey research. It's basically the same thing. You're democratizing the ability to use and understand data. All of us, working in marketing are used to working with data, I'm sure. But obviously when it's presented in a user-friendly way and you can actually see that data aligning against benchmarks that you've established, I think that's really powerful. As Julian mentioned, you can consume the data yourself or share it very easily. I think in the past, market research professionals were spending a lot of time reporting, and so we were creating charts and analyzing data and doing this. And obviously, that was useful, but it wasn't scalable, so you'd send it to the person who's making a decision, that person sits on it. Was it ready to go to the CEO of the company? No. In our firm, we report data to CVS, which, is really interesting. And we use data visualization, and it's accessible on a mobile device. So the CEO is able to go into, his investor calls and have a dashboard that basically gives him 3 KPIs. Now, our market research contact would have hundreds of data points that they're looking at, and they're making much more nuanced decisions to, kind of make sure things are all going according to plan. But the CEO has access to the 3 things he needs to know. The person probably beneath him has 20 things that they need to know, and our contact has hundreds. And so that's just one example that not only is it accessible to all, but it's really permission-based. It's very sophisticated, but simple at the same time.
So the visualization is a way for us to increase the distribution and impact of the insights that we're generating.
Absolutely.
And so maybe there's a sort of an internal politics. I know we were talking about polling, but internal politics, if you're sponsoring research, you want to proliferate it so that people will value it, right? I think we have a problem in the business where certain aspects of the marketing infrastructure look like
Sure.
ripe targets, right? The
Right.
CFO.
Right.
And perhaps for people that are defending the insight budget, visualization might also be a way to increase the perceived value of the process and outcome.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other thing that the visualization does, in addition to giving the insights person the ability to share this in a more user-friendly way, they can do so without having to burn their time creating multiple versions of a single report that's accessible. I think the other thing that's really nice is the longevity of the data is obviously, much, much better as well, because you've got access now to a report that you can refer back to. In the past, again, when research was a PowerPoint presentation, how far did that go? Right. How long did you have access to that? Was it searchable? Is it something that you can refer back to? Now, researchers are actually making better use of some of the insights they collect, because they're able to go back to one and two things and say, well, 30% of people own a dog. Now I'm going to structure my survey based on that insight.
Cool. Why don't we talk a little bit, forward into 2021? What's on the agenda at Toluna for 2021? And, is there anything, do you have any like predictions or insights or strategies that you're working with that might help people think about next year?
Sure. So so at Toluna, when COVID hit, obviously we were in probably the same position as all of us on this call. What do we do? And we're in the consumer insights business, and we did what we know how to do best, which is we sent out a survey, and we've kept the survey going now through and will continue on into 2021, asking people about their overall behaviors, how they've changed, what they're looking forward to. And initially the survey was like, it was wildly changing, what are you buying? How are you buying it? What are you doing? And it went from, through the kind of things that we all experienced as consumers. But the one thing that's been really clear to us and is a major takeaway for 2021, I think we'll see a lot more brand advertising in 2021. Consumers definitely have felt as though brands were a little bit late to react to the COVID crisis in 2020. And so the expectation, this is also kind of interesting, consumers expect a lot more from brands than brands might have thought in the past, going so far as in some markets, feeling as though brands not only did they need to advertise, and speak about the issue, but also to give back to consumers. So I think that there are going to be some brand, campaigns that we'll see in 2021 that are net new and haven't been done in the past, in order to regain that consumer confidence, and also to establish a premium, especially as many are, losing money as a result of, the impact of COVID. In order to buy that premium product, we have to really trust and feel good about supporting that brand. And so I think we'll see more brand advertising, not just to repair, perception, but also to ensure that, people are buying and they're able to charge that premium.
Sure. Hey, Julian, I was going to ask you, what are your clients, how are they trying to position for next year? Have they, any interesting things that you can tell us about how clients are positioning and trying to sense the consumer's appetites for next year, or B2B appetite?
Yeah, most of our work is B2B, but I would second what Janice is saying about the importance of brands promoting themselves and reestablishing their relationships is huge. And we've had a little inkling from inquiries that have come in that there are some projects that are looking to do that. We have one project that's looking to understand, given the new administration, what is the implication for corporate sponsored health plans? There's, with the possibility of a public option, what does that mean for corporate decision making on the plans that they offer? So there's those kinds of initiatives. I think we're going to see in 2021 a very interesting shift of this latent demand for entertainment and travel and everything else. For those who still have incomes, of course, there's a huge percentage of the population that's just going to try to get back on their feet. But for those that have been able to maintain their incomes or a version of their income, I think there's going to be a huge outpouring of purchasing and travel and entertainment. And to see how the market responds to that and delivers it, I think is going to be a very interesting study.
Yeah, and maybe the choices we're going to make are going to be different, right? If we had if we feel like a brand was appropriate or empathetic during the time, even if we weren't personally too highly impacted. And I think you're right, the impact of the pandemic has been really kind of polar, right? There are plenty of people, I think it was reported in the Times this week, the professional class has not suffered in the way that many others have. So there's a little bit of guilt around that too. Maybe it'll change consumption patterns, especially among luxury brands. Maybe they'll have to be go back to the camouflage prints or something. So maybe I think it would be good to talk a little bit about data privacy. We have a few minutes before the Q&A. I just wanted to go back to this topic because I think as marketers, we're going to be more and more affected by privacy initiatives, especially if we have any global component to what we're doing. If you guys could talk just a little bit about how things like GDPR in Europe are going to impact the research science that we're going to be able to do, that would be great.
Sure. Janice, why don't you start?
Sure. So our business, obviously we have a survey respondents in more than 30 countries. And so GDPR has been something that we've been practicing actually before it became, a mandate, because there are very significant penalties in not doing it, and it is best practice. So we've always been aiming to safeguard the consumer data that we gather. That's one of the cornerstones of our business. We want to make sure that we're not collecting, in some cases, sensitive information from people and sharing it. So we've been heavily invested in that for quite some time. GDPR was actually really a positive experience for us to digest because it's very clear. You cannot collect personally identifiable information, nor can you distribute it. So for us, that basically means that I can't ask you for your email address in Europe. I can't ask you for certain things. And then there are some more nuanced things. So if you're the only person in a certain profession in a certain postal code, I could potentially identify you. And so that's actually considered to be, in some cases, GDPR, if I know an individual person who's of a certain profession, et cetera. So it's been really interesting. From a marketing perspective, there are cavalier things that I think we all do, from sending an email file to someone of email addresses of people that all of those things are on our do not do list. And so it's basically just the principle of protecting information, anything that can be used to essentially pinpoint a specific individual. The good news for us has been that market research is always presented in aggregate. We're never looking to get to an individual person and sell to that person. So there's not been a lot of change that's been needed. However, if someone were to conduct market research, you'd want to make sure that you're working with a reputable provider for that very reason. If you're going onto SurveyMonkey and asking for email address and you're representing a big brand, that's a problem. You shouldn't do that. And so just as you're working with sampling experts, survey experts, this is an area of expertise that's really important.
Absolutely. And one of the ways we protect ourselves in our small boutique company is we do everything anonymously. That includes even our executive interviews. We have the information of who we're talking to, obviously, but when we deliver transcripts to our clients or status reports, anything that's personally identifying is stripped out. And that's the way that we maintain our compliance with GDPR. But many Americans aren't aware of the absolute strict requirements to protect privacy that take place in Europe and even in Asia, I think, to some extent. The US has been really slow to protect, but it's coming. And so anyone who deals with outside the US needs to be aware of it now and to take steps.
Sure. I mean, hey, talking about internal politics just again for a moment, I would really hate to be the marketing manager or VP of marketing whose survey went out and violated GDPR, and there was like, a $5 million fine coming at you. That would seem to be a career ender at that sponsoring company. So it's one of these things that's sort of lurking there, and having some expertise on hand to help you avoid that probably be a good idea.
Oh yeah. And I think the other thing too is we're all so global. We have no idea who's sitting in which market. Even if you think you're talking to someone who's in the US, they might be in Europe. They're protected by GDPR in that case. It's almost best to operate as though it's happening, even if it's not yet happening for you.
There you go. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to turn to some questions. We actually have a few here. So Dan asks, many people voted in the election due to their perceived desire to have a change of administration or to have him continue. As a polarizing figure. Do we think that future elections will have such high voting participation numbers, or was this an aberration due to the polarization of society and the candidates' support and positions themselves?
I'll jump in and say that I fear that polarization is with us for quite some time. I don't think it's going to disappear with the disappearance of the current president, who has stoked this partisan. But it's not just him. I mean, he inherited and was a catalyst for something that was already there and growing. So it remains to be seen. But I tend to be optimistic, but on this topic, I'm pessimistic. And I think we've got partisanship for at least years to come, if not more.
One more political question, just going back to Georgia. So are we going to get more accurate predictions on the Senate runoff races?
It goes back to that margin of error. It's all within the margin of error. So it's too close to call. I got an email the other day. I'm sure we all get emails depending on which party we're allegiant to. And, they're saying, our guy is winning because he's 1.3 points ahead. That's just irresponsible. Mm-hmm. It's too close to call.
Fair enough. So moving on from the political for now, we have a question here that I think is kind of interesting because of the nature of the ask here, which is, what's the point of view on community-based research, and how can it be applied? When is it interesting? And I think we've seen journalism kind of debunked, community-provided journalism debunked. Is there an aspect of community-based research? Can it be added on to things like a GoFundMe, which are very, very powerful drivers? How can we lever some of the new ways people are coming together to generate insights?
I think that I'll kind of jump in on this one. I think that feedback is a good thing, right? And so what Julian had mentioned earlier is the idea of the need for rigor and projectability of your findings. If you're looking for directional insights, if you're essentially thinking about doing a focus group, focus groups are great. They're good ways of starting conversation. They're good ways of engaging and maybe pulling out a headline or two or getting a directional, conversation going. They're not research, in the sense that you'd be able to say, well, 30% of people do this. The same is true of community-based. It's a great way to get new ideas. It's a great way to ideate and bring people together and have conversations. They're really good at that early stage, kind of catalyst. But would you obviously project an election based on community? No. It's a good way of getting maybe some of your best brand advocates together to think about net new programs. It's a good way to get certain folks that meet that are representative of a group that you're interested in and get their feedback.
Well, if you had a bunch of consumers in an advocacy panel, so they know they're in a branded environment to begin with, that might be an appropriate place to say, hey, if we came out with a pint-sized bottle what would you think about that?
Exactly.
Right. Because you could get some use.
Right.
some
And then in
usage
your
out of it.
mind as a researcher, what you do is you just make sure that you're not getting something that's really a great idea because those super advocates are interested. You then want to test it with the general population and say, well, am I going to get my long tail buyers? And, so it's a great way to get ideas, get conversations going, get thinking going, especially at this point, the number of new products that brands are tasked with putting out in the course of a year is huge. And so these communities can be really helpful in doing that. They can be great for vetting advertising directions, concepts, and you're actually building brand ambassadors in the process. You're getting people to get closer to your brand, which is a good thing.
Years ago, before COPD was on the airwaves, we did a study for Novartis on breathing, people who had problems with breathing. And we used a community group to get valuable insights. It was the Better Breathers clubs around the country. And we had to mail the chapter heads because they didn't have email addresses, as I recall. And it was just one of the many cohorts we went after to get from those people who truly were in this self-identified community. It was invaluable.
Yeah. So we have I think a really good question here from Melanie, which is, what's the role of incentives in generating responses? And, is there an impact on the quality of the resulting respondent panel base?
Julian, did you want to take that one? You probably deal with different types of incentives.
I was going to say, I think she's asking about incentives on panels, so I'm going to let you take that.
Okay,
part.
no problem. So basically what we aim to do is we aim to incentivize people for their time. We're not looking to pay people to participate. And so I think that's, important. Most of the people that are taking surveys enjoy doing so. We see a general life cycle to kind of, include up to 7, not up to 7, around 7 surveys. So people like to participate, whether they're getting a entrance into a sweepstakes, or a $2, let's say, incentive added to their account, et cetera. So we try to vary incentives. For us, one of the things that's sort of interesting is that we have a community of panelists. You have this website called toluna.com. We're not just emailing people. And because our website is it's a B2C to B2B site, they're actually getting surveys that are being created by brands in real time. So there's that level of fulfillment. It's not as though you register and then 2 days later you're getting a survey. And so it's a more direct model in that way. We vary things as much as possible. If we were to offer a guaranteed incentive, we would actually see a decreased level of quality, because if the first question is, did you buy a certain product within the last week? And it was an incentive of, let's say, $10. A lot of people would say they bought the product in the last week, and that's no good either. So you kind of know what to expect when you're signing up for this type of an experience. You should like to participate. You will get incentivized for your time, but you're not going to get paid for your time.
Yes, and for the executive surveys that we do, we typically are using computer-assisted telephone interviewing. We don't offer an incentive other than an executive summary. If not of the project that they're answering questions for, then a related project where we can deliver it. So it's an incentive, but it's not an honorarium, if you will. For interviewing, we haven't really talked much about qualitative research, but for interviews with executives, we do have to pay hundreds of dollars, and that's just part of the budget. But they're not doing it for that incentive for the most part. They're doing it because they're interested.
So does that interest or the incentive have a potential to impact the outcome?
It could. For qualitative research, they're just sharing their opinions and thoughts about it. So it's different than a quantitative survey answering, participating, as Janice was alluding to before, where people, if you offered a $5 or $10 incentive, you'd get people saying, well, sure, I bought toothpaste last week, so that they can answer the questions and get the honorarium. That's why you have to be very careful about how you structure that. And a sweepstakes is the way of offering something that of value, but not guaranteed to everybody.
Got it. So I think it would be good to ask you to kind of just illuminate. We had a good question here: difference between B2B and B2C research studies. And I'd love to, give people who might be crossing over the opportunity, if you're going from a consumer marketing role to B2B or vice versa, just sort of what you should be aware of, or if you're a consumer of these studies, what you need to be aware of. Julian, want to start us out?
Sure. Well, we are fortunate in that we do both types of research. We have clients that ask us to do one or the other, and some clients that want to do both because they want to compare how consumers feel about something versus a business audience. But I would say that there isn't that much difference between a B2B and B2C other than the language. If you're doing an executive survey, you need to write to the level of education, the familiarity with the topic and everything else. When you're doing a consumer study, you want to do it more in the language, say, of a newspaper or a broadcast, where the language might be a little simpler and everything else. The analysis is absolutely no different. And the other, I'm not doing it in order. I should have started with the sample frame, which is what we were talking about earlier. The sample frame is going to be quite different, but the mechanics are the same. Janice, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think basically, we do more consumer research because we obviously have a very sizable consumer panel. Typically new products that are being introduced, financial products, CPG products, FMCG, entertainment and media is a big area of study for us. And basically consumer studies have to be logical, and the flow has to really kind of match your thinking. Not that it doesn't for B2B, but as Julian's mentioning, on the B2B side, when you're asked about a certain facet of your business, or when you're asked about a certain professional aspect, you can think in that way, and your mind frame is already there. But if you're asking a consumer, to give their feedback about something, you really need to kind of walk them through a logical thought process. You can't bounce from one question to another, because obviously that skews the results, and it also has people very confused about what they're being asked to respond to. So it has to be very logical. Have you done this? Do you like this? What's your sense of this? And it's got to flow in a way that you'd have a conversation. You don't start by asking someone how much money they make in a year. You have to make sure you set the table and you've got questions that are easy to respond to. And then at some point, if you're asking deeper questions, you've earned that level of trust, and you've engaged that person in the right way.
Yeah, we talk about having softball questions. We want to ask real nice, easy questions to get people to feel comfortable. And then you have to earn their trust almost to ask for the more detailed information later on.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a good question here. Is there like an order, like between qualitative and quantitative? Do we want to do our qualitative research before fielding a broader survey?
It's great to do qualitative research both before and after if the budget allows, because in the beginning you can make sure you're using the right vocabulary and asking the right types of questions. And on the back end, you can get fantastic color about explore some of the whys that are harder to get to on a quantitative research project. But when you're talking with people about the results, you can say, we were surprised that 30% said this. We thought it would be 70%. What is your opinion? So it comes up, you can come up with some valuable quotes. But qualitative research is incredibly valuable, we find, but sometimes budget doesn't allow for it. So we have to cut it. Janice, what's your experience?
Yeah, I feel the same. Qualitative can be used often. We mentioned communities are great things to have running that are quote unquote always on, because then you can get a sense for how engaged your brand advocates are, or monitor a group of even a different type of consumer. So qualitative is always additive. It's always useful. It's particularly useful in the beginning when you're beginning to ideate or develop new thinking. As Julian mentioned, it's great to inform follow-up research that you're doing, but qualitative can basically be injected at any point you've got questions. I know companies that we work with have done qualitative research, in particular when they encounter a challenge. If you find that a product is on the market and you've gotten negative feedback about the product for some reason, qualitative is a great thing to kind of understand, well, what are people actually saying? What is the real issue? and then follow up with survey research, because your survey research might say, you know, how do you feel about X, when you've not even heard about this whole other kind of ballooning issue. And this is actually an area where outside of qualitative, you might actually even be informed by general consumer or social media data that you're scraping, reacting to, and then surveying about.
Interesting. Well, I think we're going to have to land there. This was an awesome panel. I want to say thank you to Janice Caston and Julian Beresford. You guys were amazing. For folks that want to learn more about the American Marketing Association and your local AMA Southern Connecticut chapter, please reach out to Richard Connor, membership chair, and you can see his email there. It's richard.s.connor, C-O-N-N-E-R, @gmail.com. Look for an announcement soon in your email about our annual Super Bowl ad preview. Always a lot of fun. We should have some great panelists, and ought to be a really interesting year for Super Bowl ads. Brands trying to earn trust, as we talked about earlier, permission to get people to open their wallets again. Should be a very interesting time. So thanks again, everyone, for attending. Janice and Julian, thank you so much for making today happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.